and painted a number of local plants and flowers. Beside each drawing or watercolour, I had handwritten a detailed description of the plant, based on my careful observations and probably a bit of book research. This was not a school book. This wasn't done for an assignment. I just loved to draw and paint and write about the plant world. In a sense, I began writing Seeds of Hope over 60 years ago. Of course, even as I was becoming increasingly aware of plants, or trees really, as individual beings, I was at the same time learning ever more about the animals. I especially loved the barn owls that would punctuate the night with their eerie calls, the bullfinches with their glowing red-pink breast feathers, and the herring and black-headed gulls who flew low over the garden, screaming and waiting for us to go out and throw them bread crusts. Blackbirds, song thrushes, robins, and many kinds of tits nested in our tall, tangled hedges and in the trees. There were still 1 or 2 red squirrels left on the cliff back then, but the grey invaders were rapidly taking over the real estate. Occasionally we took a bus to the New Forest, woods interspersed with moors covered in heather, where there were new forest ponies and deer, and if we were lucky, we might glimpse a fox. And let me not forget the insects. In those days there were buzzings and hummings and chirpings of bugs of all sorts. In the daytime they were shimmering, fluttering wings of butterflies. Surely they were originally flutterbys, until some medieval scholar got his F's and B's confused. Then in the evening came the irritating, high-pitched whine of the mosquitoes, and at night the moths arrived, attracted by the white blossoms and night fragrance of the syringa and white lilac, and unfortunately by our lights. There were Ollie and Danny's enemies, the slugs and snails. My sister Judy and I loved snails and often kept them so we could race them. Years later I learnt that snail racing was at one time a popular pastime among elderly gentlemen in France. Our garden had its full quota of these invaluable little helpers, the earthworms eating their way through the soil, aerating it, an important part of the ecosystem. I once took a whole handful to bed with me when I was just 18 months old. My wise mother, instead of scolding, told me they would die, for they needed the earth, and together we took them back to the flower bed. She told that story at the talk, and I think I cried. And then there were the bees, the pollinators, so absolutely essential to the gardener. I watched them for hours. Honeybees flying busily from flower to flower, the bread baskets on their legs, gradually filling with bright yellow pollen, as they performed that all-important task of pollination. The big... Oh dear, I'm not used to reading out loud. The big, furry-coated bumblebees, jet black with 1 or 2 bright yellow stripes on the abdomen, who really did bumble from flower to flower, seemed almost lazy by comparison with the honeybees. It was fascinating to see them push their way into the foxglove flowers and watch as the blossoms trembled with the invisible visitor, probed for nectar. When I got my first job as a secretary in Oxford, I was able to explore a different part of England. Every weekend I set off on my bicycle into the surrounding countryside, exploring lanes and hedgerows, which is, in those halcyon days of the mid-50s, were a riot of wildflowers. I would leave my bike and wander through the fields, past grazing cows, keeping a wary eye for the occasional bull, and getting familiar with cow parsley, or Queen Anne's lace, campion, speedwell, ragged robin, and the mauve sweet-scented clover that was so beloved by bees, and the cattle and horses too. Sometimes in the evening I would hire a little canoe for an hour and paddle, silently, past bulrushes and reed beds, nosing in toward the bank, where I could be hidden in the cave of green under the trailing branches of a huge weeping willow to watch the mallard ducks. I remember that a couple of verses of a very different sort of poem would sometimes repeat themselves in my mind in a somewhat annoying way. They came from one of my favourite childhood books, The Wind in the Willows. All along the backwater, through the rushes tall, ducks are a-dabbling, up tails all. Ducks' tails, drakes' tails, yellow feet a-quiver, yellow bills all out of sight, busy in the river. I could only paddle a mile up river, partly because I could only afford the canoe for an hour, but also because one then came to a stretch of river that was forbidden to women, named Parson's Pleasure. It was reserved for gentlemen who desired to disport themselves in their birthday suits. I knew of girls who would hide for hours in thick undergrowth to get a glimpse of certain body parts, and I suspect all the men were well aware of those immodest eyes. Not only did my mother... I think there's just ducks down in the dam. Sorry. Not only did my mother preserve my nature notebooks, she also saved the 3 copies ever produced of the Alligator magazine, written at about the same time as I was painting local wildflowers. They were put together for the benefit of the 4 members of the Alligator Club, me and Judy and the 2 friends who came to stay almost every holiday, Sally and Susie. I was the eldest and bossed everyone around and planned the games we would play and the things we would do. Sally, a year my junior, and I were the real tomboys. Sue and Judy, the little ones, 3 or 4 years younger than me, were not quite as keen on climbing trees and pretending to be Robin Hood and his men. But we got on well together, and when I was about 11, I started the Alligator Club. Why I picked the ad name Alligator, I have absolutely no idea. It was a club for nature lovers. We watched the plants and animals and wrote little stories in our nature notebooks about them. Well, to be really truthful, I did those things and did my best to persuade the others to do the same. This was easier when we were together, but when Sally and Sue went home for the holidays, it was hard. So I put together a magazine. I wrote by hand, as there was no other option at the time, articles about all sorts of things, and asked the others to make contributions. Of course, there was only 1 copy, so after they read it, Sally and Sue had to return it. In the next edition, I asked questions about the articles I had written in the one before. The members were supposed to put their answers in the letterbox, an envelope glued to the inside of the cardboard cover at the back, and after 4 editions, I tired of producing this magazine, since it was almost impossible to get the others to contribute, and only Judy answered the questions, and only because I bullied her into doing so. But it taught me a lot. In fact, it may well have been my experience with the Alligator Club that enabled me to persevere in developing what is, today, a movement for young people from kindergarten through university, now in over 130 countries, Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots. The Alligator Club had only 4 members, including myself. Roots and Shoots is encouraging hundreds of thousands of young people to take action and to try and to make this a better world for all living things. Looking at my nature notebook with the carefully drawn and painted flowers, and looking through those magazines, preserved from a long time ago, brought those magical days of childhood alive. I found myself thinking about cold, wet winter